Hi again, Year 12. This is another video about the problem of evil. So, as I said in the last video, we're going to look at two Theodicies. And first one is going to be Augustine, and the next one is going to be Irenaeus, and how it was developed by John Hick. We're also going to look at this thing called process thought. So this video is going to be the Theodicy of St Augustine, really from start to finish. Mostly I just want you to, if you can print off the slides that I'm going to send you, that'd be great, and just follow through, may add any notes that you need to, if you need to write anything down next to them. There's also one slide that'd be good for you to print on A4 if you can, which is like a table, and I want you to kind of fill in the details of the table. It'll all be clear when you come through it, but apart from that, that's all I want you to do. Watch the video, go through the slides, take any extra notes you need, and then complete this table on the A4 sheet. And I'll talk about that sheet when we come to it. So a theodicy, what's a theodicy? So we talked about last time, an explanation of how we can believe in an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God in the face of evil. Who's Augustine? Augustine is a convert to Christianity who became a monk and a bishop, so he became very high up in the church, and he's probably the most well known of the early Christian philosophers, and most well regarded. Although it's worth saying that there are certain ideas that St Augustine has, particularly the idea of original sin, that many Christians reject. And for that reason he can be quite controversial. Okay, so let's do point by point. What did he say about evil? So St Augustine argued that the Bible shows that God is wholly good, and that he created the world perfectly good and free from any defect, evil or suffering. So he uses this quote: God saw all that he had made and it was very good. So he says, well, God's good and he made a good world. But obviously there's a problem there. Why is there evil? So this is basis of his idea that evil is not a thing. God created all good things good. Evil is not good. Therefore, evil is not a thing. So that is his logic, and this is where the whole idea of evil as a privation of good comes from. It's almost like a logical thing for St Augustine. St Augustine says, look, God made a good world because he's a good God, and also it says in the Bible he made a good world. He saw what he'd made and he said it was good, and therefore all things that God made were good. Evil's not good, and therefore he thinks evil cannot be a thing. Now, what does that mean? That might strike people as strange. So let's go into that in a little more depth. Before we could look at that bit, I just want to have a little bit of a look at why these ideas were so important to Augustine, because in a way, Augustine, like a lot of philosophers, to understand what Augustine is saying, it's quite often good to understand what he was arguing against. So Augustine was opposed to Manichaeism. Manichaeism was a religion that was around at that time, which Augustine once followed. Now, Manichaeism, I can't remember how you say it, believes there are two forces in the world, good and evil, which were constantly at battle and equally powerful. So that's the idea in Manichaeism, that there's these two equally powerful and opposing forces, one good and one evil. Always reminds me of like Star Wars with the Force, the good side and the bad side, whatever. And when he converted to Christianity, Augustine rejected this view. There cannot be another power in the universe that's a rival to God. Only God is responsible for the universe we have. So if you think about it, that Manichaeism would be a bit like if you met a Christian who said, oh, the reason there's evil in the world is because of the devil. Now the logical problem with that is, in Christianity, God is all powerful, and so defeating the devil doesn't pose a problem for God. God should be able to defeat the devil. So what he's trying to do is get away from that view. He's trying to get away from that view that there's like a good force and an evil force, and that bad stuff in the world is just a result of the evil force. Because he wants to say, no, there's only one all-powerful force in the universe, and that's the force for good. That's kind of the basis of why he's so keen on rejecting this idea that there is, there's some kind of evil force in the universe. Because in Manichaeism, yes, the good force is the better side, but it's not necessarily the most powerful side. It's constantly in battle with evil. So Augustine's characterization of evil is as a disorder, or what he calls a privation of good. Privatio boni is the Latin term. This is not to say that evil does not exist, but to say that evil isn't a thing in its own right. he compares it to darkness, which isn't a thing, but rather the absence of a thing. It's just darkness is just the absence of light. In the same way, evil is said to exist as an absence or lack of goodness. An example that's often given is this one: a ripped shirt. The thing that makes it a bad shirt is that there is a hole, there's nothing, a hole, where material should be. So if someone rips a hole in a shirt, there's not like a thing that's been added to the shirt, it's that there's a lack of something, there's a hole where the shirt should be. So there is evil, but it is not a thing that God made. Instead, it's when things in the created universe that should be by nature be good, do not live up to that goodness. There's a lack of that goodness. That is what evil is, according to the thing. And again, the logic of this is the most important thing to understand. The reason why that's important is because all this stuff is important for Augustine, because he wants to be able to say, God didn't make anything bad, it's just that some things failed to live up to God's standard. So here's his famous quote: "Evil has no positive nature, but the loss of good has received the name evil." So when humans are evil, they fail to live up to the potential God gave to them. For example, they might to be kind, to be generous, that's how God created people with that in mind. But some people fail to live up to that, and that is what evil is. Okay, next point. God created humans with free will. This is a good thing. So it's that means that we can fail to live up to God's standards. He created us good, but he also gave us free will. Now, this is seen as a good thing. Why? Well, without good free will, we'd be like robots. We could not make the choices that make our lives meaningful and joyful. E.g., we couldn't make a choice to marry or have children, or most importantly to Augustine, to love God. Now, that doesn't mean if we had free will, we could do those things, but we wouldn't have done them by choice. And so for Augustine, that mean those things lack meaning. To love, to make a decision like get married, to have children, they've got to be choices you make that you've made a choice to do, otherwise they lack any meaning for you. But having free choice, of course, means that we are free to make choices which go against God's plans. We are free to make choices that do not live up to his intentions in creation. This creates that privation which we call evil. So because we have free will, the possibility is there that we'll go against God. But the key thing is the world would be a worse place, if, according to Augustine, if we didn't have free will. Because although it means there's a possibility for evil, it also means there's a possibility for meaning, and for our lives to be meaningful and joyful. Okay, so in part, Augustine's ideas about evil are about free will, but it's a bit more complicated than that, because he focuses on one particular instance of people using their free will. So that is the fall, the story of Adam and Eve. So in the story of Adam and Eve in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, the first human beings use their free will to turn against God. They eat the fruit of the garden in the Garden of Eden, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's what it's called. It's not an apple, or it's called an apple. It's just called the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And they eat this fruit when God specifically told them not to. And so this is kind of like the original act of rebellion against God, of going against God's wishes for us, which brought evil into the world. So how do you think about natural and moral evil in these things? So natural evil occurs because of the loss of order in nature. When human beings went against God, when the original human beings, Adam and Eve, went against God, it created a loss of order in nature and caused these punishments for human beings. And that is what natural evil is: punishment for the sin of Adam and Eve. So Augustine defined natural evil as the penal consequences of sin. Penal meaning punishment. So the punishment for sin is natural evil. Now, in the book of Genesis, in the story of Adam and Eve, it gives specific punishments. So the punishments for Adam and Eve are: one, they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. But secondly, men are given the punishment of having to grow food So previously it was just miraculous, food just appeared in the Garden of Eden. After the punishment, men have to work hard to grow food in order to survive. And women will suffer pain in childbirth. So again, before the first sin of Adam and Eve, the idea was that childbirth would be painless, there would be no suffering. But that afterwards there would be pain in childbirth. So, as you can see, now the whole idea of Augustine's philosophy isn't all in the story in the Old Testament. So in the Old Testament, the Bible, it never says that, you know, the punishment, all suffering or all evil in life is because of Adam and Eve's sin. But it does say that the punishments for Adam and Eve's sin will not be limited to them. God says in the Old Testament that all men will now have to work for food, and all women will suffer pain during childbirth. So you can see where Augustine got the idea from. So this is the idea that all natural evil now is a result of, is basically punishment for the sin of Adam and Eve, that we are suffering because of their sin. Moral evil comes from human free will. But the interesting thing about Augustine is he kind of says that after the fall, something happens where humans are no longer in harmony with God. It kind of affects not just Adam and Eve, but all people after them. So it's almost like Adam and Eve let the genie out of the bottle, or they put that idea of rebelling against God into human society, and because of that, everyone who came after them was more likely to sin. So that is the two things that happened then when Adam and Eve sinned. One, they brought about natural evil in the world because people were being punished for their sins, and secondly, they opened up the possibility that was already there, because with free will you have a possibility to do bad, but they made it more likely by kind of somehow creating this gap between humans and God, and making it more likely that people after them would do the wrong thing, would rebel against God. It's worth saying that Augustine talks about more than one fall. He also talks about the fall of angels. So just as humans are given free will, so are angels. And again, this isn't completely in the Bible, but traditional Christian belief is that Satan was an angel, and he led a group of angels to rebel against God. And because of that rebellion, they were sent out of heaven. It says sent out of Heve there, I should say heaven. Now, this fall is also seen as part of the explanation for natural evil. So it's not just Adam and Eve's fall, it's the fall of the angels from heaven. That both of them play a part in the kind of move from the natural world into like this amazingly great place towards it being a more being full of evils, all as punishment for these sins. Now, there's also a clear link between the fall of the angels in heaven and the fall of Adam and Eve, because Adam and Eve are tempted by the devil to go against God, or they're tempted by a serpent, and that it's often interpreted that serpent was the devil. Because you might read that story of Adam and Eve to say, hold on, if Augustine is saying there was no evil in the world, until they used their free will to go against God, why was there a serpent tempting them to do the wrong thing? But that could be explained in terms of, well, that serpent was there because that was the devil, and he used his free will to go against God. He was banished from heaven, and then he played a part in Adam and Eve's going against God, if that makes sense. So there's two falls: the fall of angels and the fall of humans. So they sinned. Why are we suffering now? The idea is that in some way all humans were present in Adam's sin. The idea comes from St Paul in the Bible. He says, sin came into the world through one man, he means Adam, and death came through sin. So he's kind of saying the reason people die is because of Adam. So the interpretation there seems to be, if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned, they would just live forever in paradise. The reason we die is because of that sin. So death spread to all because all have sinned. So somehow St Paul seemed to be saying all humans were present in Adam's sin, like that was something kind of we all took part in, which seems like a strange idea. Now, Augustine reasoned that all humans were worthy of punishment, of the punishment of evil and suffering, because they were all seminally present in the loins of Adam. Now that we've talked about that in GCSE, but that is his strange biology. I mean, that people didn't know about biology then. So his idea about biology, Augustine, would have been, and I think it was commonplace at that time, is that the way in which children were made were, they used to think that humans were present within the man in a very tiny form. And then when a couple had sex, what they thought was that humans go from the man into the woman and they grow there. They didn't know about eggs and sperm fertilizing the eggs, and the idea that both parents material from both parents played a role in creating the new child. They thought the child was in the man, and then the man planted the child in the woman, and then the person grew. So that means that in some sense, everyone was present within the loins of Adam, because his children were within him, and their children were within them, and so on and so on and so on. So everyone was there, and therefore for Augustine, everyone's equally deserving of punishment. Now there's a massively problematic idea, and we'll come back to that later, because that is probably one of the biggest problems with what Augustine says. Now, where do we go from this? Well, some people say to me, well, hold on, isn't Augustine a Christian? Doesn't he believe that we've been forgiven by Jesus and all this stuff? So why are we still suffering? Well, it would not be right for God to intervene and put a stop to this suffering. I mean, God could, as all-powerful, just say, right, these people have sinned, the punishment is suffering, but I'm just not going to punish them. However, God is also supposed to be just. Part of his omnibenevolence is supposed to be that he is just and fair. So that means that if people commit sins, they should be punished. So, it would go against his omnibenevolence, the fact that he's fair and just, if he didn't punish us for our sins. So God should punish us. So Augustine concludes that if God was simply just, so he's definitely just, if he was just, fair, only fair, everyone would get their full and rightful punishment, and that would be to go to hell when we die. Because we rebelled against God in the sin of Adam, therefore we deserve to go to hell. However, God is also loving, so he's just and fair and also loving. In his infinite love and grace, he sent his one and only Son, Jesus Christ, to take the punishment for all of our sin and to die on the cross so that those who believe and accept can be saved from hell. So even though he allows evil, God is all loving. So what he's trying to say here, this is the complexities here, is that he's trying to say God has to be a good, an all good God, an omnibenevolent God. He has to be fair, so he can't just take our sins away, but also he has to be loving. So how does he be fair and loving? Well, he says we're going to be punished for our sins. However, he sends Jesus to take on our punishment for us. So it's not that there's no punishment. Someone is punished, and that's Jesus. But if we believe in him, he will take on our punishment, and we can go into heaven. So the whole point is it means that human beings, yes, that they've rebelled against God, but because God is all loving, they still have a chance to be saved from the punishment of their evil. That saving doesn't come now, because if you just saved everyone, if you just took all evil away and made the world a paradise now, that would be to deny us to use our free will to be saved. We've got to use our free will. We've got to voluntarily become Christian, follow Jesus. He will die for our sins, and then in the next life, then he'll take away all suffering. That's the idea in Christianity. So that's the basic explanation of suffering for Augustine. The world was made perfect. Adam and Eve rebelled against God, and then we have moral and natural evil in the world because of those things. The stuff at the end about Jesus dying for people's sins, well, that only becomes important when if someone says, well, hold on, isn't God supposed to be all loving? Why is he really just going to punish people? So it's this get out clause to say, well, actually, God is just and does punish people, but because he's loving, he also gives people a way out, which is through Jesus. There is a second part of his argument, which is I always find interesting. Augustine also gives what's called an aesthetic argument. Aesthetic is to do with the way things look. Aesthetic, the way the appearance of things, that kind of thing, beauty and all that kind of stuff. Augustine gave another explanation of why God allows suffering. He argued that when the creation, universe is seen as a whole, the contrast between what is good and what is bad highlights the beauty of goodness. In other words, evil is worthwhile because it helps us to see the goodness in creation. So evil, bad stuff in the world, allowing things to go wrong, allowing bad stuff to happen, helps us to understand the beauty of good stuff in the world, the beauty of stuff that's really good. I think a bit of a problematic argument, but it is one that's often suggested to me. We wouldn't understand the good without the bad. But yeah, there are some big problems with that argument. Okay, this is the sheet I want you to print off, and these are all quotes from Augustine. I just want you to read them and then see if you can explain what they mean. What I'll do is, if you just what I would do now is, if you can pause the video at this point and then read through the quotes, just see if you can understand what they mean from your point of view. Do you understand them? And then unpause and I'll talk through them, then make your notes. Okay, I'll just go through them. So, first one, since there is happiness for those who do not sin, the universe is perfect, and is no less perfect if there is misery for sinners. The penalty for sin corrects the dishonour of sin. This is all about God being just and good. So he's saying there's happiness for those who do not sin. So people who do not sin, good people are rewarded and go to heaven. People who don't, it doesn't make it less perfect, he's saying, if there are people who are punished, if there are people who go to hell, because sin corrects the dishonours of sin. God is actually making the world a better place by sending bad people to hell, because these people are bad people. They've rebelled against God. They've even been given the opportunity to be forgiven through Jesus, but they've not accepted that, and so they deserve to be punished in hell. If God didn't punish those people, it would actually be a less perfect world. It would be a worse place, according to Augustine, because for the world to be a good place, there has to be proper punishments for people who do something wrong. So this is basically to explain why God is punishing people. Why, if he's so loving, why doesn't he just forget about their sins and their rebellion against him and just let it go? He's saying God can't do that because that would actually be a bad world, not a fair world. Okay, next one. Evil has no positive nature, but the loss of good has received the name evil. We talked about that one. That's just the idea that God is all loving and God is all powerful. So he created a perfect world. And it says in the Bible it's perfect. That means nothing that God created in the world is bad. So that means that bad has to be not something God created, or evil has to be not something God created, but a time when something that he created fell away from being as good as he wanted it to be. Okay, next one. That which is the evil of all things, in which any evil is perceptible, is corruption. So the corruption of an educated mind is ignorance. The corruption of the just mind, injustice. The corruption of the brave mind, cowardice. In a living body, the corruption of health is pain and disease. This follows on from what's there before. So he's saying evil is just when good things go wrong. So being ignorant is not a thing. It's when a mind, which could be very well educated, isn't very well educated. Corruption of a just mind is injustice. So when we do something that's unjust, that's unfair, if we treat people unfairly, that isn't an active thing, he says. It's God has created you as a person who with a sense of justice. We've all got that sense of justice that God gave us. If we act in an unjust way, if we don't treat people well, that's not something that God gave to us. That's us failing to act up to the standards that God set for us. He created us with the ability to be just. If we're unjust, that's us going wrong. It's like a fault in us. So in every time he says anything that's evil or anything that's bad is not something God has created. It is that thing not living up to God's what God wanted it to be. Last one. God judged it better to bring good out of evil than to suffer no evil to exist. So this is an interesting one, because God would have been able to see, God's all knowing, that when he brought people into the world and gave them free will, that they would use it to go against him. And so that evil would come into the world. He would know that. However, the point is that God thinks human beings have, and human beings specifically with free will, a really important thing. It's a good thing to create them. And therefore, he thought it was better to create human beings, even though he knew they would go wrong, and then get redemption or salvation for human beings by bringing Jesus into the world to die for their sins. That whole complex story of human beings going wrong, it resulting in a massive amount of suffering and evil, natural evil, moral evil, and so on and so on. It was worth doing all that and then bringing Jesus back, die for their sins and save people. It was better to do that than to create nothing, or to create human beings without free will so they always did the right thing. So, and that's an interesting thing in a way, because it's an interesting argument, is that he's basically saying God had a choice. He could either have made human beings as he did with free will and have this really complicated and often full of suffering and misery world that we've had, or he could have not created human beings at all, or possibly he could have created them as robots who just did what he said. Now the point is, God obviously thought it was, he's saying God thought it was better to do this, create good out of evil. In other words, create human beings with free will, which meant evil would happen, which means they would have to be, Jesus would have to come and die for their sins. All that whole process, with all the suffering it involves, would be better than not creating humans at all. It would be better than creating humans without free will. That's what he thinks. Some people might disagree. If you look at the great evils of history, some people might say, look, free will's great and everything, but surely it would be better to have not created humans or create them out without free will, better than creating having a civilization where things like the Holocaust occur. But his point is, he's saying no, however much bad happens in human society, it was worth it because it's good to create humans with free will. However much damage they may do, however much they may rebel against God and treat each other disastrously, it's good to create a world with free will because it means that human life has meaning. Okay, that is the end of my Augustus thing. So make sure you make your notes. You might also want to think about this. What are the problems with Augustine? You've probably thought of some already. We did some at GCSE. Most people, this is a sort of very traditional, Christian approach to the problem of evil, which many atheists, I think, found a bit of a ridiculous answer, and also many Christians today have a bit of a problem with this way of looking at evil. And that's why things like Irenaeus have become more popular, I think. So think about what the problems are, and we'll do another video on this week, hopefully, on the problems with Augustine. Okay, thank you.